It's a beautiful morning.
Excellent. Glad to hear.
William, I hear you had some challenges getting to Israel.
Not if you have wings and can fly.
It was like a longer travel than us in Australia to get to Israel. Horrible.
Okay. Unfortunately, our projector system is still not working, and I apologize for that. I gave it over to our tech guy on Friday, and apparently it's still not done. So we'll just continue. If you have your WhatsApp, you can bring it up on your WhatsApp. And it's on page Lamed Hey. And yeah. So what we were talking about is just get rid of this. Quit. There we go. Okay. We're talking about buying stuff from a ganav. And so and so we're up to Lamed Nun Zayin. If the owner has not given up hope of retrieving his stolen object after it's sold. So a guy steals something, sells it off, and the owner is still hoping for retrieval. And then we discover who the ganaf is. And then there are witnesses who can identify that this is the stolen object. So the object that was stolen goes back to the owner. So that's what we had established. But we also said there's something called takonas hashuk, where the owner has to pay the buyer who bought it unawares, okay? And then, in order to retrieve their out-of-pocket expense for getting their stolen object back, they have to sue, and they have to litigate against the ganav. Ve'im ganav meforsim hu lo asu bo takanas hashuk, but that's only if the owner of the buyer is completely innocent. The buyer had no way of knowing that this was a stolen object. If, however, the seller was a clearly recognizable ganav, then the rabbis did not make such an accommodation for a buyer who knows that he's buying fenced goods or should have known that he was buying fenced goods. And therefore, the owner, when he retrieves a stolen object, does not have to give the buyer anything. If the buyer wants to go ahead and sue the ganav, let him go ahead, and he can sue him, right? We only make that accommodation for ethical buyers, right, who had no way of protecting themselves. Okay? So this is the opinion of the Machaber. Ulam das hagab pasak kedas osam rishonim da'af beganav meforsam asukanas hashuk. However, the Rush and the Tur and the Ri, all are of the opinion that even if a person should have known that the seller, the person who was selling him the object, was a ganav, the rabbi still made an accommodation for that kind of buyer. And even in that situation, you're obligated to return the money to the buyer, unless you can ascertain that the buyer actually did know. In other words,
it's kind of difficult to ascertain that, to know that was the gun or not.
It is
the goods were hot.
Because a guy could always say, well, I didn't know.
Right.
Okay. I guess if you were doing a sting and you had someone was wearing a wire, or there were witnesses who were able to testify, this guy knew for sure it was stolen, right? So then we would not do takana sashuk even according to the Rama. But if a buyer claims, and we have no evidence against him, he says, I really didn't know that this guy was a ganav, or that I didn't know that these were stolen goods, even though I knew that this guy maybe has a questionable history, right? So according to the Rama, we still do takana sashuk and we pay the buyer for his efforts. Now, next, im nisyashu haba'olame hagneva. Now, this concept of yeush after theft is an important it creates an important halachic mechanism, because up until now we're talking about the rights of the owner of the stolen item because he hasn't given up hope of retrieval. He hasn't had yeush yet. But let's say the owner has yeush, he's given up. Bein shenisyashu v'achar kach mochar, bein shenisyashu achar shemochar. It makes no difference whether the ganav still has it in his possession or not at the time when he has yeush. Kana lokeach b'yeush b'shinei rishus ve'eno machzir hageneva atzma leba'aleha ela nosein lahem damim. So you need two ingredients in order for the object to not go back to the original owner. You need yeush and shinoi rishus. What is shinoi rishus? That it has left the hands of the ganav. So if both of those conditions have been met, then the owner is not entitled to get his original item back, but he's entitled to be compensated for what it was worth at the time of the theft. So, so the buyer will be I guess exempt from having to pay him because of takana sashuk, or if there's no takana sashuk because the guy knew that it was stolen, then he would just have to pay cash back to the original owner, but he doesn't have to give him the original item. That's the opinion of the Mechaber. Ulam das harama kedas hatur b'shem harash. That, however, the opinion of the Rama is a little bit more complex. He says, "De'im nisyashu la'achar shemachar lo kana lokeach." If the yeush only happened after the buyer acquired the item, so then he's not entitled to it. De'ein yeush v'shina rishus kona elim nisyashu kodem shemachar. He says, because the only time that having yeush will help once it comes into the hands of the buyer is if the owner had yeush before it came into the buyer's hands. Okay, so that's the subtle difference between the Mechaber and the Rama. The Mechaber holds that as long as at some point the owner had yeush, as long as it's now in the hands of the buyer, he gets to keep it. If, however, but according to the Rama, the yeush has to have happened before it came into the possession of the buyer. If the owner had still not given up hope, and it came into the possession of the buyer, even though the owner had yeush afterwards, the buyer has to return it to the original owner. Okay, next, Pero shenashru, produce that falls off a tree. Pero she'enam nimasim b'nefilasam v'rov ha'ovrim heim Yisraelim asurim mishum gezel. If a person owns an orchard and let's say his orchard abuts a public area and the produce falls nearby, and a person wants to pick up an apple or an orange or whatever, and it's perfectly fine. I mean, as far as the quality of the produce, in a place where the majority of passersby are Jews, it is usher to take any of that produce. And if the produce belongs to orphans, minor orphans, so then even if the majority of the passersby are non-Jewish, you still are not allowed to take that produce.
It's on the ground.
It's on the ground, but you're not allowed to take it unless it's actually rolled into a public area. The reason is because it's all dependent upon yeush, meaning that if a person has produce and he knows it's on the side of a road, he's going to have yeush and give up hope on getting that produce because he knows that the Gentiles on the road that are passing by will probably take it for themselves. So he gives up hope of retrieving that produce. If the majority of the passersby are Jews, he doesn't, because he can put up a sign saying, do not take the produce, and he expects the Jews to be law-abiding citizens.
Even if it falls into Rosh Hashanah?
No, I don't think that this is true if it falls into
Right.
Rosh
There's
Hashanah.
many
I think,
places, like I know in Eretz Yisrael,
Yeah.
across the street from us, there's a tree, two trees that someone's backyard, a path that goes into a public park. And it's a lemon tree and a clementine tree, and
Mhm.
people are always taking.
mm,
It's on the tree though.
No, it falls.
Okay.
And even if it's hanging over, people will go over
I was gonna say,
and see people and take. Now, what about an issue of truma samaisers? I think it's, if you just take it and eat it by itself, you don't have to take truma, if it's one off. If it's a one off, if you're collecting a dozen
no.
lemons,
If you bring it home, you still have to take.
if you bring it
trimmings.
home, you have to bring it, but if you eat it
So,
right there, you
if
don't.
you eat it
have
right
to.
there,
Yeah,
you don't have to. Right. But I know it's
So this is regarding trees that are in private property,
yeah. Mhm.
because I mean, there's an apple tree that's in the water at the end of Clark going back into Galcrest, whatever it is, that bears fruit and drops all the time. I mean, that's in the public pursuit, so if you pick up fruit off that tree, you're not stealing it, so.
Mhm. You're not stealing, right? Because it's
It's in the public area.
it's in the public domain, yeah.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
so if here in Israel, the city sometimes plants fruit trees and then they hang over into the Rishus Rabbin. And I was reading that you don't have, if the city does not care about the fruit itself, then it's perfectly okay for people to take it.
yeah, because the city did it for the purpose of benefiting the public. Yeah, so it's not stealing.
Yeah.
However, if it's owned by a private individual and it's still on his property, but it's just at the side of where you walk, then you would not be allowed to take it.
Right.
Okay. So now this next section is called She'elot Utshuvot Biktsara, shorthand responsa, meaning we're going to get into real life cases. She'ela. Ganav shenichnas labayas olachatzer, v'higbia es hadover shirotza lagonvo, v'kana hageneva. Okay, a ganav goes into someone's, let's say, backyard, picks up the thing that he plans on stealing. So remember, we said that once you pick it up, you've now acquired it for purposes of liability. So if something were to happen to it, remember we talked about the sheep, you pick up a sheep, it gets a heart attack and dies. So you can't just put it down and say, whoops, and then it's like slowly back out. No, doesn't work. If you're on camera, so then you're going to be liable for the death of the sheep. Okay, so in this case, he picks up something, but he realizes this thing is so heavy and so unwieldy, I'm going to need someone to help me. So he asks his friend, hey, Moshe, come, help me schlep this thing out of the backyard. So Moshe comes and he helps him. Michayev begeneva, ha'im haganav shehigbia es hachefetz, o hasheni shehotzio mirishus haba'olam. So who's liable? Is the original ganav liable because he picked it up and then becomes liable? Or is Moshe who schlepped it out for him? Because Moshe is like a starker, he's a real strong guy. But Lamaisa, the first guy, was the one who really stole it first. So who's the liable culprit? Okay, so
Who actually took it off the property?
well, that's the question. Moshe took it off the property, but the first guy, we'll call him Yankel. Yankel was the one who picked it up. So by picking up the object, he was kind of with Geneva.
And then, the second guy knows that it was stolen.
It was probably standing beside him if he took it off the property.
Could be he knows. We would have to probably assume that he knows what's going on. Okay.
Is there a thing in Ketubah where the person on where there's two avarice that are done. One is picking up to steal and the other one is doing it on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, if you're in somebody's house and you pick up the item, until you take it off the property, you actually haven't stolen it, but because you picked it up on Shabbos and it was muksa, you now.
I think you're thinking not of muksa, but rather of hotzah, the malacha of carrying something out into a public domain.
Place on Shabbos. So,
Yeah.
so you've got these two things, but until the item's actually off the property, one of them doesn't count.
Well, no, I think maybe you'll have to go back to that case, try and look it up. But maybe there it's talking about where you're dragging something off a property. But here the person actually picked it up. Anyway, Ganav shenichnas l'makom ploni, v'higvia es hageneva, ve'eno yachol lahotzia. So a Ganav who goes into a specific place, a private area, lifts up an object that he's stealing, and he's not able to take it out, and another person comes and takes it out for him. O shehutzra chaganav livroach, v'lo hayachol likach imo hageneva. Or let's say the first guy who picked it up realizes, hey, I got to get out of here. I hear the siren coming, I hear voices, whatever. Kegon she'echad ala besulam v'nichnas hachalon v'ganav tachshitim. So he gives the following illustration. Let's say a guy climbed up a ladder, goes into a window on the second floor, steals jewelry, okelim yikre erich, or very valuable items. Hasheni omed b'racho v'zezarko lecheko. And there's another guy on the ground. And the guy, it's a two-man job, as they say. So you got the guy upstairs, he's taking the valuables and throwing them out the window to his friend that's on the ground.
The getaway car.
Well, no, the driver is the third guy. This is a two-man job. You don't watch enough of these shows. Yeah, so Hasheni nechshav ikar bazeh. So in this case, it's the second guy who's considered the main culprit, shehotzio v'nimtzeis hageneva biyado, because he's the one where it's now when it got off the property through the second guy, and he's the one who's holding the stolen goods. V'im chazer hasheni v'nosno l'rishon chayiv zeh shehotzio v'nimtzeis hageneva biyado. But if, however, the second guy turns around and gives it to the first guy, so whoever has the geneva in their hands is the guilty culprit.
Well, but the person in the window picked it up. They didn't inquire by picking up the jewels.
Right. That's what you would normally think.
Up to Rosh Hashanah was the other guy.
There's two steps here though, so which is.
Right. It's a two-step geneva. So because it's a two-step geneva, the person who ultimately has it left in his hands is considered to be the ganav.
What would secular law be the same?
I think secular law would be that they're involved in a common enterprise. And they're be considered joint tortfeasors, so they're both.
Joint tortfeasors?
Yes, both. Yeah, well, a common enterprise makes them jointly liable,
Okay.
and because they committed a tort of civil theft as conversion, they'd be committing a tort. Their common enterprise makes them jointly liable for that tort.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you think they're both completely guilty? Like,
Well,
why are we trying
clearly.
why are we trying to say one is worse than the other? They're both gonna, like, I don't know, like.
I'm not sure I understand why we wouldn't just split the liability,
Exactly.
but does that mean that they're both liable for half? Like what does it mean at the end of the day?
Aren't they both jointly and severally responsible for everything in the Kinfolokon? If one guy goes bankrupt and can't afford to pay back stolen object, the other guy is completely liable, or either one of them are jointly and severally liable for everything.
The rabbi's right. There's a presumption that jointly liable people can't figure out what the percentage is, 25%, 3/4, whatever. You're by default equally liable, but you could be 75% liable and 25% liable for whatever, right?
Yeah.
In civil law?
Yeah, 100%. It's called the Contributory Negligence Act, and the
Yeah.
judge has a discretion to apportion liability according to the degree of fault or, wrongdoing.
Yeah, but criminal law, they would both equally have the same amount of jail time, right?
I think, I'm not really an expert.
I
don't have no idea.
That's a most part.
Ask Prucci. I don't.
Okay, I'd like to look into this a little bit more, but that's, well, that's, and the footnote is not very helpful. Because the footnote just,
But if the second person wasn't there, if you take the scenario away and the first person was in a field and they threw the produce out of the field into the public reshute and then walked out and picked it up, they would be responsible for it at the moment of the profit.
yeah,
So
they'd be
understand.
responsible from the time they picked up the fruit.
And so
They're
in this
liable.
case, why would, I mean, I can understand the person who's caught with it in their hand is responsible because he's been caught with it in his hand, but surely the first start of the process was the person picking it up inside the property to throw it out the window.
Right, you would think so, right? You would think so. So why it is that the person who takes it off the property is liable is, I guess, because until it's actually left the property, it's not irretrievable. But I guess we'd have to look into this a little bit more. It's very incomplete the way that it's being explained. So I'll try and get more information.
Rabbi,
Yes,
is this not consistent with if, let's say, there's a bench and 10 people sit on it, and the 10th person actually breaks the bench, he is the one that's responsible for the payment of the bench? So it's ultimately the last person?
right. Well, it's because he's the straw that broke the bench's back, right? In other words, he's the person who was the one who placed excessive weight on the bench. In this case, the act of Geneva starts with the first person. The act of breakage does not start with the first person who sits on the bench. But I'm not sure if those cases are comparable. But I still want to research this a little bit more and figure out what's going on. Okay, I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that today because it's a busy day, but I'll see at some point. I'd like to look this up. Okay, Tam Pisul Hamasachek Bekuvia. Let's go on to the next tshuva. A person is puzzle because he's a gambler. Now, what does this have to do with theft? So you'll see in just a second. There are certain activities that are not technically gezela from the standpoint of the Torah. But our sages nonetheless forbade these activities because it's a form of gezela, or it appears, or it's close to gezela. Kagon, an example of this, hamasache bekovia, a person who professionally gambles in order to earn his living, shuhu pasul le'edus midirabanan. The rabbis declared this person to be not a valid witness. Like if a guy is constantly, he plays poker for a living. There are such people, professional poker players. They're good at it and they make money from it. So if a person is like that, so he's not allowed to be a witness at your son's chasana. Okay? So the question is, why is this person puzzle? What has he done that is so wrong? He's engaging in something that is completely consensual among adults. And why is this a form of theft? Okay. So the response is as follows. Tshuva, hamasachik bekuvya nechleku chachamenu ha'amoroyim betam hapsul. There's a difference of opinion among our sages as to why this person is puzzle. Rami bar Chama oimer, kevin sha'osim tanai beinehem, shekol mi sheyenatzech es chaveru ba'osum masachik yekabel sukum shel kesef kach v'kach. He says, one opinion in the Gemara is Rami bar Chama. He says, basically, there's an agreement, an implicit agreement when you sit down at the poker table, that whoever wins will get a certain amount of money. Zu asmachta, but that's something that is what we call an asmachta, which is an assurance that we're not sure that we can rely on that assurance. The asmachta nikre shekol tzad shemakabel alatzmo tzad asafek atoli b'tanai Yadua mibali gemirus das, right? Lahaknos l'sheni. He says there's not a full commitment mentally from each person to completely relinquish his money. In other words, people don't really, with a full heart, relinquish or have in mind that they're going to lose. And since people are really hoping to win, they're not really relinquishing the money with a full heart. And as a result, there's a form of theft involved whenever I win the hand, because the people are resentful of having to relinquish their money. Now we're going to continue this tshuva tomorrow. I want to finish about 2 minutes early today, just because I have to lead the davening this morning. I have the yard site. So we'll hold it here.